Hi, my name is Dave McMillan, and my presentation is entitled Collective Responsibility and Global Poverty. And it follows similarly my paper, Collective Responsibility and Global Poverty. And I'm excited for you to join me. So my thesis, the thesis of the paper, is that high-income countries, as distinct from the obligations of their residents, have a collective responsibility to determine how, through the use of evidence and reason, to best prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, and take sustained action on that basis. In this presentation, I'll do 7 things. I'll first identify the scope of extreme poverty and the need for increased humanitarian contributions. Second, I'll summarize Peter Singer's argument, where he claims that individuals have moral obligations to those living in extreme poverty. Third, I'll extend Singer's argument to the moral responsibility of nations. Fourth, I'll outline the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for moral responsibility. Fifth, I'll distinguish 2 types of groups, conglomerate collectivities and aggregate collectivities. Sixth, I'll demonstrate that nations are conglomerate collectivities. I'll explore the moral implications of the view that nations are moral agents and therefore have moral responsibility. And seventh, I'll address potential objections to my thesis, mainly the argument from shared responsibility, the argument from methodological individualism, and the claim that nations' duties are to its residents and not to those living in other countries. So there's a large global challenge, and it's extreme poverty. 700 million people live in extreme poverty. By 2030, estimates are that 500 million people will still live in extreme poverty, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has made matters worse, not better. There's a gap between what the US should contribute as a high-income country, as an affluent nation. There's a gap between what we contribute and what we ought morally to contribute. One estimate is that it will take $175 billion per year over the course of 20 years to end extreme poverty. The US gives less than 10% of 1% of its annual budget to humanitarian causes. There's a gap. There's a gap between what's needed to end global poverty, specifically extreme poverty, and what high-income countries, and the US as a leader in transfers of humanitarian aid to developing countries, specifically to end extreme poverty, there's a gap between what's needed and what's given. On the left, we can see a Columbia submarine, which costs the US $14.4 billion to procure. We know that if we give that same amount of funds to Oxfam, Oxfam can provide 96 million toilets to those living in extreme poverty and connect those toilets to septic systems. So we know that for that $14.4 billion to purchase a submarine that the US will not even use until 2031 and will actually rarely use, we can, for the same amount, purchase a toilet for everyone living in extreme poverty, every family living in extreme poverty. So there are trade-offs in how funds are used. Singer proposes a thought experiment. He says, imagine that you're walking to class, and while walking to class, you see a child drowning in a nearby pond. You look around, you don't see the child's parents. The child will drown unless you wade in and save the child. The pond is extremely shallow. You won't be injured trying to save the child. Should you save the child? People say, yes, we would. The second iteration, Singer asks, what if you have an important obligation? What if you have to go give a lecture or go for a grade appeal discussion? What would you do? Would you still wade in to the shallow pond and save the child? Or would you worry about that obligation? Suppose you won't get the A in a course if you wade in and save the child. Most people would say both instances, yes, we would still save the child. An A in a class is not comparable to the value of a human life. What if, says Singer, instead of in a nearby shallow pond, the child is drowning in sub-Saharan Africa? And for a small amount of money, we could guarantee for certain that we could save the life of that child. Do we have a moral obligation, living in an affluent nation, to make a small transfer to save that child's life? Singer says, yes, we do. And many people do as well. And this comes as shocking because we mostly think that our moral obligations are towards those nearby us. And what Singer is showing is that those living in extreme poverty deserve individual contributions from us as individuals in affluent countries. We should give more of our annual income to those living in extreme poverty. I've taken Singer's argument and I've applied it to nations as distinct from their residents. And the four premises that follow just adjust the referent of moral responsibility from individuals to nations. It claims that the suffering and death of normal and healthy human beings from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad. The second premise is that if a nation can prevent death and suffering without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable significance, the high income country ought morally to do it. Third, geographical distance and international relations between any two given countries are morally irrelevant. There is no morally relevant distinction between cases in which a high income country can act unilaterally and in which the high income country can act multilaterally. And it follows that high income countries have a moral responsibility to prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. So if Singer is right, and if I can prove that nations are moral agents, specifically high income countries, then it seems to be the case that I've succeeded in extending Singer's argument to other moral agents, specifically nations. To do this, I have to show that nations are moral agents, but I first have to share what are the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for moral agency. The challenge is that there is significant disagreement as to what are the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for moral agency. Peter French provides an account. His account includes corporations. The account is expansive enough to include groups like McDonald's or BP. To French, both of these corporations would be considered moral agents and therefore can have moral blameworthiness and praiseworthiness associated with them for their actions. To him, we need to be able to provide a statement, specifically an assertion. We need to say that McDonald's is responsible for a particular event and that they intended to complete that particular event. Very broadly, some agent, specifically a corporation in the mind of French, should have the ability to control its actions and the agency to intend and complete those actions. Virginia Held's account is that there are two conditions. First, an individual should be aware of the actions that they're undertaking. So if Max murders Jake and Max does so thinking that he's stabbing a mannequin and not a human being on a set of a film production, then Max can't be said to have intended or to have been aware of the moral worth of his actions. And the second is that individual should know the anticipated moral value of their actions, to know that taking a life can be reasonably expected to be a moral harm. And Held's account in her papers applied to random collectives. So both are non-traditional accounts of moral agency. And I root both my claims and their claims in this paper because I do believe that they are representative enough of the literature on moral agency, which typically associates two necessary conditions. The first is the ability to control one's actions and the ability to know the moral worth of one's actions. It's similar to accounts of mens rea and actus rea in the legal tradition. So the next task is to determine what type of groups nations are. So there are broadly two types of groups that we can say pertain to questions of moral agency. The first would be an aggregate collective. For example, we might say everyone who is 7 foot tall and above are technically in a group. The group is the set of all people who are above 7 feet tall. Now, can we find moral fault with this group for the actions of an individual, or perhaps even social conditions? Consider, for example, that people who were above 7 feet tall had fortunate social and economic positions in society, and that there were extreme inequalities between people on the basis of height. Would we be able to say that the group of all people who are 7 feet tall are responsible for the conditions that they find themselves in, even if they aren't responsible for how that situation arrived? Well, we would say that people who are 7 feet tall don't choose to be 7 feet tall, and that the death and birth of people who are 7 feet tall actually alters the group. When one member of that community, the community of people who are above 7 feet tall, dies or is born, the group changes because membership to that group is based on the property of being 7 foot tall or above. It's different for conglomerate collectivities. Conglomerate collectivities are generally not bound by the sum total of the identities of members. Consider a corporation. A corporation isn't sensitive to whether or not there is a particular CEO who's in charge of that corporation. A nation, similarly, is not bound by whoever the president is at a given time, or the particular attributes of members of that country. We would say that the identities of members of the US, all of its residents, all their particular identities, they are different from the identity of the nation as a whole. In aggregate collectivities, there is no decision-making process for the collectivity. There's no way that people who are above 7 feet tall come together and make decisions. There is a weekly meeting of people who are above 7 feet tall. And as a result, there's no clear decision-making process for that group, although there is a group. Next, for conglomerate collectivities, there is a clear decision-making process. When a corporation issues public shares of its company, public stocks, it is taking an action, and that action stemmed from a decision-making process that included multiple levels of the corporation. Different people had roles in going public and issuing public stock. There was a clear decision-making process. And it is my belief that nations are conglomerate collectivities because they have this clear decision-making process. Nations can undertake specific actions. Some of these actions are only capable of being undertaken by nations and not individuals. Individuals don't wage war. Individuals don't pay reparations. Individuals don't collect nationwide taxes. Individuals also do not pass legislation. When we say that the US passed legislation, consider the 13th Amendment, for example. When the 13th Amendment was passed, that wasn't the action of an individual. It required 2/3 of both houses of Congress. It required the approval of the president, and we can point to a clear decision-making process for how this proposal became law, specifically as an amendment. We can't say that any one individual is morally responsible for the passage of the joint resolution that permitted the US to go to war, specifically the war in Afghanistan. There was no individual that was personally morally responsible for taking those actions. The action could only be taken as a nation, and it required the passage of a joint resolution. So there are certain actions that nations can take that their members, specifically their residents, can't. In the same way, a soccer team can be said to score goals, but its members technically perform that action. They score the specific goals. Rather, I should say that soccer teams win and lose matches, but its members score specific goals. We can associate one goal with a particular player, but we can't say that the player won the match, or even that the player won the match for its team, because there are a certain number of players that are needed for a team to participate in that match and not be disqualified. So there's a specific rule, and the rule is that multiple members have to be on a team. And the team is the agent in the match. It's not the players. The players constitute the team, but the team itself wins or loses matches. In the same way, the identity of a nation is distinct from its members. Consider, for example, a situation where an act of genocide unfortunately kills all members of the state of Wyoming. Is the US different as a result? I would say no. The identity of the nation, the US, is not dependent upon membership in Wyoming. Wyoming would still exist as a state, even if no one there carried out the laws. Wyoming would still exist, but even more importantly, the identity of the US would stay the same. How about if the president of the US resigns or loses re-election? Is the identity of the nation different? No. I find that the identity of the nation is not sensitive to changes within membership. If people come and go from the US every day, a baby is born or a person dies, the US isn't different. And what does this mean? Well, this means that nations are conglomerate collectivities. They have clear decision-making processes. And because they have clear decision-making processes, we can apply accounts of moral agency to nations. Specifically, we can test whether or not nations are morally responsible for their actions. When the US dropped bombs on Japanese cities, killing tens of thousands of civilians, it intended to complete those actions. Even though Harry Truman had 85% support of Americans for dropping those bombs on Japanese cities and murdering tens of thousands of civilians, those actions weren't taken by Truman. Those actions were part of a process, an elaborate decision-making process, and ultimately actions were carried out accordingly. If nations are responsible for what they do, specifically horrible acts of war, they are also responsible for what they fail to do. And specifically, global poverty and extreme poverty is an example of nations not owing up to their obligation. We can say, in the words of French, that nations are the cause of bombing Japanese cities and murdering tens of thousands of civilians. And we can say that they intended to complete those actions. In the same way, it is impossible for a nation to ignore its obligations to those living in extreme poverty. We can't say that the US has been negligent in its responsibility. US aid is committed as an agency in the US to humanitarian assistance providing it. And we are aware that extreme poverty exists, yet we're doing nothing about it. This satisfies the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that French and Held are proposing. The US is aware of its actions. When it takes an action, it's aware of the moral worth of that action. It's built into the decision-making process. And because of that, we can say that nations, as distinct from their residents, are responsible for certain actions that they undertake. And those actions can't always be reducible to individuals. So the key objections that might be raised against my thesis are as follows. The first is the claim by methodological individualists that actions and moral actions are reducible to individuals. I find that that is impossible. In the case of passing legislation, we can't say that any one individual passed legislation. The actions are not reducible to specific individuals. They were taken by a group, and therefore the group ought to bear responsibility. The second is the claim of shared responsibility. Joel Feinberg has a fantastic example where he says, suppose that someone is drowning and there are 1,000 accomplished swimmers on the beach. if the person drowning dies of asphyxiation, are all 1,000 swimmers collectively responsible for the death of that one person? They could have saved a life. They were more than capable of saving the life. They know the moral value of a life lost, but they did nothing. So shouldn't we hold them all responsible? Feinberg says that that would be it would make no sense. It would seem absurd that we should hold all of those people morally responsible, or specifically legally responsible. And I don't have to disagree with Feinberg, because I do believe that the 1,000 accomplished swimmers on the beach have no clear decision-making process. They're a random group of individuals who are on the beach together, and there's no clear decision-making process for what to do in an instance of someone drowning in the ocean. We might find moral fault with specific individuals, but the group as a whole wouldn't bear responsibility as a group. Individual members should be evaluated based on other conditions. The third is that a nation has a duty to its own residents. That might be a belief that some people reading my paper share. And when we give contributions to those living in other countries, we aren't, according to this objection, meeting our duty to our own residents. Suppose, however, that an undocumented resident travels to the US and finds permanent residence. Suppose that that individual is hit by a bus. Just because they aren't a US citizen doesn't mean that we should refuse them medical treatment at a hospital. Hospital beds are finite. The undocumented resident would take up a bed, but we would say that we should treat the undocumented resident because their life has worth. And specifically, we can do something about that. We can save their life. Where that undocumented resident was born is irrelevant. It's trivial compared with our obligation to save that life. Suppose someone can't escape a war-torn country or extreme poverty, and they are in a similar instance of harm. We would say that there is really no morally relevant distinction between someone who is able to escape and someone who doesn't escape. Both individuals deserve our support, specifically our financial support. So what this paper has succeeded in doing is to provide the first actual account where moral responsibility and moral agency has been extended to nations as distinct from their residents. David Miller has provided an instance where nations can possess outcome responsibility for their actions. Specifically, we can say, according to Miller, that nations can be responsible for the outcomes of their actions. But he doesn't go as far to say that nations can be morally responsible. This paper has succeeded in claiming that nations are moral agents and therefore have moral responsibility. It's possible to reconceptualize national obligations that extend beyond extreme poverty, but this paper has used extreme poverty as an example of a problem that nations are uniquely tasked to solve, and in which they are doing a suboptimal job. If this paper is correct, nations, as distinct from their residents, have a moral obligation to prevent the suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. And they have a moral responsibility to take sustained action on that basis to address extreme poverty. And I'll close with a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, who has a fantastic quote. I am somehow, he says, less interested in the weight and convulsions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. While I do think that Peter Singer and the proponents of effective altruism are doing a worthy job in changing people's minds on their individual moral obligations, the challenge of extreme poverty is too great for individuals to solve. Even if Bill Gates takes sustained action, he doesn't have enough money to solve the problem of extreme poverty. Nations are specifically tasked with addressing the raising of revenue. Nations can pay reparations, nations can raise revenue, nations can undertake specific actions. Nations know the moral value of their actions. We can look to the Emancipation Proclamation, and leading up to that, Abraham Lincoln knew the moral value of his actions. The EPA in the Federal Register notes that it has moral obligations. The US is aware that it has moral obligations. The question is it ready to accept its moral responsibility to extreme poverty and take sustained action on that basis? I think they should, and this paper seeks to defend that thesis. Thanks so much.